Final Fantasy VII Rebirth has some of the greatest mini-games you can find in open-world gaming. I would say it has the best mini-games since X-Game, but in this case, X-Game would be Like a Dragon Infinite Wealth, and despite the splendor of the Gold Saucer, it just can't compete with Sujimon and Dondoku Island. But that's nowhere near a fair comparison. Like a Dragon has always been about minigames, and this is Final Fantasy's first outing. But Rebirth is no slouch when it comes to the variety of distractions on offer. However, like Infinite Wealth, there are more central minigames in Rebirth, which take the form of the cards game Queen's Blood. But despite being the headliner for side content within the game, I can't help but feel let down and a bit confused about Queen's Blood's significant presence within the world, and I also can't help but think that another minigame would have been better with a larger presence across Rebirth's runtime. Now, card games are nothing new to open world games or even Final Fantasy, although I admit I haven't played 8 or 9, so I can't compare Queen's Blood to the likes of Triple Triad or Tetramaster. But what I have played is the direct influence of Queen's Blood, and that's Gwent, the card game that's arguably better than the main game of Witcher 3. Gwent was a game of strategy that never overcomplicated itself and made itself a core part of Witcher 3's world. I wouldn't compare Gwent to any real-world card games as it's much simpler, and that's what worked about it, and that's why the Gwent spin-off doesn't appeal to me, because it's becoming something it was never meant to be. But that aside, Gwent was a game that was easy to learn and easy to master. The test of the game was when to forfeit and when to attack. Queen's Blood isn't a card game by any means. It's a chess game in which every piece does something different, and position is what matters more than anything else. The beauty of chess is just how much it can evolve from its base form. You can add simple stipulations like segregation chess, where pieces can only move on spaces the same colour as them, or even add new dimensions to chess. In fact, there's a horrifying game on Steam called 5D Chess with Multiversal Time Travel that I'm humiliated to admit that I have played for over 30 hours. And while this game is ludicrously complicated, at its core it's still chess. That means all the pieces move in the way you know them to, and you don't have to know every card for every piece you get. And this is where Rebirth trips up. Since positioning is what matters more than anything in Queen's Blood, you need to learn what every individual unit is capable of, including your opponent's cards, which you have no way of knowing unless you already own them. This means that when you're just starting out, Queen's Blood can feel like a game of chance, as you have no way of knowing which of your opponent's cards are causing which effects that's happening to make you lose. If it helps at all, the key to winning Queen's Blood isn't getting the strongest cards out on the field, but it's stealing your opponent's spaces to make sure they can't place any monsters. I know this because the game forced me to learn, but we will get to that. First, we need to talk about how Queen's Blood is presented within the world of Rebirth. Across Velen, Skellige, and Novigrad, you would naturally discover that the world was populated with Gwent players, and most of them had some purpose outside of the card game, like being an established character or merchant. It made the world feel authentic, and that this was a game that had become naturally popular and had taken over the residents of the continent, and it also gave the player a reason to talk to every NPC and possibly discover some other secrets entirely. Queen's Blood players in Rebirth only exist to play the game, unnaturally glued to a spot next to a board, just waiting for a spiky-haired challenger. I said in my last video that Rebirth isn't good at letting you discover things for yourself, and this is a prime example. But the thing that genuinely made Gwent special was the discoverability of it. The entire game was optional, and it was the joy of discovering the game that made every nameless village an exciting find in Witcher 3. And if it wasn't your thing, and you just wanted to slay monsters, then you could easily ignore it. Could you imagine if Witcher 3 held the plot hostage until you had demonstrated a mastery over a set of skills that was completely unrelated to the core gameplay of the title? That sure would be bad game design, wouldn't it? As far as I'm aware, you are forced to win 5 consecutive matches of Queen's Blood with definitely worse cards than your opponent in order to progress the critical plot of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. Okay, so as I was writing the next section, I just couldn't wrap my head around the fact that this team wouldn't have made such an egregious game design error and that despite my in-game search to quit the tournament, there had to be some way to give up. I found out that you can forfeit the tournament, but nowhere in the game does it tell you this, and speaking to the NPC with an icon above his head isn't the right one, so it just needs to be telegraphed better. While Rebirth's minigames, including Queen's Blood, are really fun, they should by no means be used as a mandatory skill check that the player has to pass in order to continue the game. If you'd like to hear me give a more favourable comparison of Rebirth to a legendary open world game, then click the box on the left, and I'll see you in 2 days for another Rebirth essay.